This is for a school project. It is in autoethnography. Everything I say here is from myself, and I'm the only voice speaking, so there's no consent forms needed. Two of the questions asked were from people around me, and they know that this is for a school project, so with that out of the way, I'll get into the questions. So the first one is, I should say a bit about myself. My name is Sienna Scullion. I'm 20 years old. I am a woman. I come from a lower income background. I am white and I live in Canada. I'm currently in my third year of education at Carleton University. And that will segue into a bit about my life with OCD. So I've had OCD for most of my life. For me, it is most likely genetic, and I most likely have inherited it from my mother. I had OCD throughout my childhood, but I didn't really know what it was until I was about 13 years old and went to receive help for intrusive thoughts. Ever since then, I've had to learn how to live with the symptoms of OCD because the symptoms are essentially compulsions and intrusive thoughts. So I have thoughts that distress me, and then I have compulsions around it. For me, these tend to mostly be about violence and sex, but they can also be about things like my health and sleep. For the most part, I am able to manage it with the use of a medication called Zoloft, which is an SSRI. I try my best not to let it get to me, for the most part, which leads into the question somebody else asked me, which is how does it affect my daily life? For me, it affects my daily life in a number of ways. Firstly, it affects my daily life in the sense that I oftentimes end up spending time in my day to overthink or do compulsions, which can be really distressing, especially if I'm in public somewhere where I don't want people to notice them. It also really heavily affects my sleep. Sleep tends to be one of the main things that OCD targets for me personally. And that can make it very hard because if I don't get enough sleep, especially the next day, my intrusive thoughts tend to be worse. It can also just affect my daily life because I can see how other people view and treat OCD. People are very uneducated about it and they're very uninformed. And this can cause people to say things like, oh, I'm so OCD. And in reality, they just, like things neat and tidy. Meanwhile, I actually have to live with the consequences of having OCD in my day-to-day life. The medication I started taking has made my day-to-day life a lot better. Before I was medicated, it was very difficult for me to function normally. I would be able to go to my classes and stuff, but I would just have a general sense of unease and I would be very unmotivated to do my hobbies, which, that can be a very miserable experience when all you do is work, school, and then come home and sit there and do nothing because you're just so stressed out. Now I'm much better. I still have depressive episodes and periods where it gets particularly bad, but for the most part, I'm able to manage the symptoms. I had another individual ask me, how does living in Canada provide any particular stressors? And I would say that it does. I think that Canada is a very individualistic culture, and that can make it very hard to talk to other people about what you're going through. People have a very much mentality of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, especially for women, I find, because being a woman, people, will call you overdramatic, they'll call you hysterical, they kind of boil it down to your gender. If you overly speak about your mental health struggles, it's kind of just chalked up to your sex, which, it makes it hard to talk with about other people, because then you feel kind of isolated and you feel that you shouldn't be behaving this way. I'd say that Canada too, because I'm in a first world country, oftentimes I feel very stressed out, looking at other nations and seeing what little our nation is doing to help other people. And this can be it can add to the stresses and the issues that OCD brings onto oneself. Luckily, Canada doesn't necessarily provide me like with stresses from like political violence and stuff. I live in Ottawa and it tends to be relatively calm here. So that is one thing that I don't have to struggle with. How does my economic status intersect? I think there are many ways that my economic status intersects. Firstly, being poor definitely makes my life more stressful, which like causes my symptoms to be worse. My family and I have had to deal with like economic stress in relation to my education, in relation to the house, in relation to healthcare, and economic stress like in that sense like makes it so your symptoms get worse, because when you're stressed out economically you end up overthinking and having more intrusive thoughts like, oh, what if this goes wrong, what if I don't have money to pay for this, what if, and these thoughts can be very hard to deal with. But I also feel like having a lower economic socio-status has made it hard to receive help, because mental health care in Canada is not free. Unless you're going through a crisis, you have to pay for it, and like a consistent therapist can charge anywhere between like $100 to $300 per session for an hour. And for me, like for the most part, that is not an obtainable like the social service, because it's just overly expensive. I have to put my money towards my education. I already am on OSAP loans, which is its own stressor for me. So therapy, now that I'm at school and there's counseling and it's free, I can go to that. But like therapy when I was younger wasn't really a consistent option just because of how expensive it was. And even if my family was willing to pay, I was over worried about how it would cause financial stress to them. So that was never really like a true option, which made my symptoms get worse, because if you're not able to receive help, then you're kind of like screwed in that sense. Now I'm on medication, and luckily I have insurance through my dad and through my school. Even if I didn't, my medication will only be about $20 monthly. So I am lucky that I wouldn't have to worry about that. But if my economic status got worse and I didn't have insurance, I might not be able to afford that like $20. So for me, I definitely say my economic status has impacted me, not only like by causing more stressors in my life, but also by like restricting my ability to receive help. I'm not like overly, like, I'm not like the poorest of the poor, but I'm definitely not rich. I do think that if I was richer or had a higher socioeconomic status, that my OCD would probably be more manageable and better, especially when I was younger, because I wouldn't have those added on stressors, and I would be able to receive whatever like help I wanted. Like I would be able to like pick between more therapists and like have a wider range of like medication and treatment options available. The next question is, how do you think being white impacts you? I definitely think that it has not made my life harder. Canada is a settler state, which means that white people and other settlers are like the dominant group and they are the oppressors. And for me, I don't experience things like racism, and I'm not questioned on my mental health just because of my skin color or my race. Due to that, I definitely feel as though like being white gives me an advantage in a way, because if I was, let's say, black or Asian, I would also experience things like racism, internalized racism, and like my family might experience like racism or like racial prejudice, and those experiences I feel like would add on to the stressors of having OCD and living in Canada, because again, Canada isn't it's a settler state, it's a white state in its like conception, which means that like people of color have not been respected and are not of like the main target group for like care. I also feel like another thing is like I don't have a culture that doesn't respect mental health, because I know that in a lot of like immigrant families, oftentimes it can be harder for the children to talk about mental health struggles because their background may not have like talked about it in the same context as we do in Canada. Because my family is like Canadianized French and German, my parents are able to like talk openly about mental health, and for me that wasn't a barrier that I experienced. So I definitely say that being white and living in Canada has made me have an easier time with like the illness itself, but also accessing help. So the next question is, how is receiving help been? I, for a long time, did not go to receive help for a number of reasons. One was, again, the economics, but also I was worried about, like, judgment and how receiving help would, like, impact me. I've received help more recently, and overall, it's been relatively welcoming. Being a woman has been a bit like, has been a cause for anxiety to a certain extent because a lot of therapists and like health counselors are men, and I definitely feel more comfortable talking to like women outside my family, like about mental health. Like the male family members I can talk to. When it comes to strangers, it's a lot easier to talk to women. I was lucky enough that I was taken seriously, and now that I'm in university and I have like counseling for free, I can receive more help. And it really has been a big help in like managing my symptoms and the OCD. Being able to receive free counseling. Overall, I would say it's been a very mixed bag. And is there anything else I want to talk about? I'd say generally, I feel like my experiences probably reflect many people in Canada and receiving mental help, that it is already hard enough to do, but then being like a woman and being poor makes it even harder to do. And these things, it's kind of like, a vicious cycle where, being of a marginalized group causes stressors, but because you're a part of a marginalized group, receiving help is much more difficult. So I would definitely say that it's an interesting experience that I am in, and I definitely feel like sometimes I'm in a cycle, and I would assume that a lot of other people in Canada who are part of marginalized groups feel like that. I would also assume that like people that are POC have a harder time than me receiving help and probably have like worse symptoms solely for the fact that like racism is very like inflammatory towards the body, and it's very hard to experience, especially for people that are younger. And then you add on being a woman, which that intersectionality creates a whole other world of like struggles and experiences. So overall, I'd say that my experiences are probably reflective of people that like are similar to me and that other people in marginalized groups, but I'd say that I don't have the exact same experiences. So again, this is the autoethnography of Sienna Scullion. Everything here is done with her consent, and any of the questions asked by other people are done with their consent, and they know what it's being used for. And that's all.